Hello, I'm Reverend Leah Antwala, and welcome to Clergy and Collars Getting Coffee. Today, I am joined by my special guest, the Reverend Quinn G. Caldwell. He is the chaplain of the Protestant Cooperative Ministry at Cornell University. His most recent book series is of daily reflections for Advent and Christmas. It's called All I Really Want, Readings for a Modern Christmas. And you can learn about them more if you follow him on Facebook at Quinn G. Caldwell. And Quinn and I first met years ago as we were both students in the same class getting our Master's of Divinity from Union Theological Seminary in New York. So welcome, Quinn, to my show.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Yes, this is exciting. So you pulled up your, I love that you're supporting your college as
Yeah,
where you now serve as a chaplain, but you also attended there for undergrad.
yeah.
Now, what you're doing now and the degree you worked on at Cornell they're vastly different.
Yes. So I did environmental science as an undergrad. At the time, I thought I was doing a pre-law sequence and going to go on and be an environmental lawyer and participate in the saving of the world that way. But when sort of three-quarters of the way through my undergrad degree, I started feeling a call to ministry, and so, aimed off in a different direction in some ways, but I'm still participating in the saving of the world. So that's good. And and
Wow.
I'm as much an environmentalist as I ever was. And I think that clergy speaking from the pulpit and, using the authority that we have given to us or have earned to speak on behalf of the planet and all God's non-human children really matters. So
Yeah.
it, you know, on the surface it's very different, but at the core my heart is still leaning in the same way.
And you really do practice what you preach. Like you've helped me convert to like no paper towels. Um,
Hey.
Yay. They still sneak in the house sometimes. Sometimes
Yeah,
my
yeah.
husband does sneak them in. But we just sort of I just follow, I'm like, Quinn's doing it, so it must be the right thing. Like
Yeah, you need some paper towels though. Like if you eat bacon, how are you going to drain bacon if not,
yeah.
or when the cat barfs, like you don't maybe there's some heroes that use reusable things to clean that up, but not me.
No, I thought you were a hero when you used reusable diapers for your children. And I was like, that's not me. I can't, that's not, I don't, I mean, it's so ridiculous though, because it's not like you don't deal with it. Like you have to clean
Yeah,
your kid up. So
yeah.
that's sort of that was mindset on my part. But like, you compost, you like have you have a yard where you can do that. But you've always been mindful of. I feel like it was the first time I didn't even know it existed, like solar and or hand crank radios that you had from your time in Peace Corps that you brought to seminary. And I was
Oh,
like,
that's so funny.
what sort of weird magic is this? Because Harry Potter had just come out. So everything I didn't understand was weird magic. But yeah, so you've been doing this is lifelong for you. This is not a new venture intertwining
Yeah.
things.
Yep, that's right.
And so do you get to ingrain that does Cornell practice that? Like, is that something you get to do as a chaplain and model there as well?
Yeah, to the extent I can. I mean, it's a huge institution,
Yes.
and it's there's uh, I feel like when there's any huge institution is going to have trouble being as like environmentally friendly as like an individual household can be, just because
Yeah.
there's gazillions of needs out there. And so the university definitely tries, it definitely leans, and it's not there yet.
Well, I mean, and also you have things like the cooperative extension and other things. They work environmentally in a variety of ways, like,
Yeah,
you know, drought seeds and all this other stuff. Like I can't even I mean, some of my church members work at those stations or
yeah,
used to
Geneva,
yeah.
yeah,
Yeah, and what they do, I can't even tell you because it's so specific. Like this one bug on this one plant, you know,
yeah.
it's fascinating. Like all those details that go into creating something that many of us aren't even giving brain thought to.
Yeah. Yeah, so Cornell is the land grant institution for New York State. So that means that a chunk of Cornell spends a lot of time thinking about agriculture and environmental issues and food security and all that kind of stuff, and then has extension offices all throughout the state. And so one thing that I love about that is that it gives me a chance to talk about the intersection of faith and science a lot. I mean, you can do that anyway, but there's some very immediate things going on here that are easy to, talk with our students about and preach about and whatever, because I really think that science communication is essential in these days. Like anyone who lived through 2020 and the years after should know how important science communication, clear, accurate, sort of absorbable science communication is. And so I try to do that in my little sphere to the extent that I can and to the extent that I'm qualified for. But to have such good, important, forward-thinking research going on around us all the time, it just makes it pretty easy. There's always something to talk about.
Now you initially you did well. What you're doing now as a chaplain is very different, but you also spend a great deal of time writing. Now do you write for, now your UCC is your ordination.
Yep.
So do you work predominantly with a UCC publishing house, or is it, I'm not exactly sure how that works.
Yeah, so the United Church of Christ does have its own publisher, the Pilgrim Press, the oldest continually operating press in these United States.
You just love saying that, don't you?
Yeah.
Just joy, just succeed. Yeah.
So one of the books that I wrote, particularly for a UCC context, was published by Pilgrim, and then the Advent book that you mentioned was published by Abingdon Press, which is another denominational press. And then most of my writing is through UCC denominational stuff. There's a group of us that produce resources of all different kinds for use by local church pastors.
Yeah, you do like daily
members.
Devotionals and things like that. Like
yes, it's called the Still Speaking Daily Devotional. Just look it up and subscribe. A little bite of God in your inbox every morning.
It is lovely. I mean, and I tend to use 365. But I will check it out. I will make sure my devotion. So every week I send an e-news blast to my congregants, and the devotional always starts that. And that's typically where I grab it from. But maybe this week I'll grab it from you. I'll see what you all are offering. It's Still Speaking. Because I mean, it's not like I do use a variety of resources. I think it's good and healthy because I think that, and you kind of mentioned it, right? Like when we live in a theological or faith space, we have to dialogue with other entities, whether that's denominations or science, or hopefully what's happening in our community, what's happening globally. And there are times where it gets really tricky. Now, I work in a very different setting than you do. I work in a congregation who has a 200-plus-year-old history of being Presbyterians here in this community, and have been planted like on this site since I think it was 1815 that we actually moved to this site where I currently sit. Not this building. This building came in 1870, but the church had been here since like 1815. It moved from the country into this more city space. But like my congregation is like my community. It's like my town. It's representative, but yours is very transient, I imagine, at a university.
Yep.
And also your age demographic would be decidedly younger than many of us preach on a Sunday. So yeah. What is that like? How do you, because you've done both, you've done variety of services. So what's that bridge like for here? Do the kids want to hear? They're not kids, right? They're adults. Do they want to hear about the same things as like an aging congregation, or is their lens and perspective very different?
So yeah, it is very transient, and we're particularly focused on students. So that includes undergrad and graduate students. Anyone is welcome to come, but we're actually lightly not forbidden, but we're encouraged to not spend a lot of time reaching out to like faculty and staff. They really want us to be focusing on students. And so, that has upsides and downsides. That I've only been here for a year and a few months at this point. But some of my favorite people are going to graduate in the spring and, go off into the world. And that's sad. And then hopefully, new people come in. So so that's good in that, like, it means that whatever we do together, if it stays with them, will then be carried out. It doesn't just stay right here.
Right.
So that's very good. It's also good, at least in theory, like if there's somebody that is a real pain, every church has at least somebody that's a real pain. And usually you have to wait a long time before they leave one way or another.
Yeah,
But
sometimes it's a pastor.
yeah, sometimes, right. But that's not true here. You just have to wait 4 years. Although I will say that I happen to have none of those, and it's so far in my time here, have had none of those. So that's great. But I have sometimes thought, man, if I ever have one, it'll be nice to have them graduate, but not yet, not quite. And then the other piece of context, I'm going to answer a slightly different question than the one you asked.
No, go ahead.
That is so good is that so as a local church pastor for the first 15 years or whatever of my career, and loved that, but that means you spend most of your time hanging out with other Christians, and maybe if you choose to, if you have a heart for it or whatever, you may be doing interfaith work too. I hope everybody is, but you could get away with not if you didn't want to, and you can't get away with that here. The building where my office is full of religious identities, of kind of everything that you can think of, every identity that you can think of does something in this building sooner or later, maybe has an office or just worships or has meetings or whatever. And so there'll be days when I'm walking through the building and like you walk by one room and you can smell incense and hear chanting and like peek through the door and there's students worshiping with idols, and
Right.
that's the language they use, and that's language that's highly charged for some others
Other
of us,
religions, yeah.
but it's like it does not have a negative valence. It has a positive valence for them. And then you walk further down the hall and you can hear people singing in Hebrew, and then you go down the other hall and there's people outside the Muslim prayer rooms taking their shoes off and heading in, or down the hall in the bathroom doing ablutions before going to pray, and then the Catholics are worshiping upstairs and I'm getting ready for it. And it's like the world could be like this, we could do this as a planet.
You're the literal coexist emblem.
Yeah, right, we are that bumper sticker. And it's not that that's without friction sometimes,
Right.
Of course so one thing that I probably will never get over being so foolish about is I always turn off the lights in the bathrooms when I leave, and I'm a little grumpy about it. I'm like, oh, why are these on when I walk in? And then
Because you're an environmentalist, right?
Right, exactly. And one Saturday morning I was here and had gone, had coffee. So I'd gone a couple times and kept finding the lights on and kept turning them off. And finally someone came to the door of my office and was like, do you keep turning off the lights in the bathroom? And I was like, yes, because the planet. And they were like, well, we're Jewish and this is our Sabbath and we can't turn the lights back on when you turn them off. And I was like, oh. It just had never occurred to me, like, and so they're like, could you please turn them back on? And, of course I did. And now I'm just pay attention in a different way. And
you're like,
still turn them
okay,
off if
so
it's
I
on a
won't
Wednesday,
do that
but
on
not
Friday to Saturday night, right? Like you won't turn off the lights then, right? I mean,
that's
it's
kind of a like small, like, well, it wasn't small to them, but it's not earth shattering, but just like that, you got to figure out how to live together. And some of us from historically dominant religious traditions need to like, I'm grateful to be having my mind and my thinking constantly like pushed further open.
Well, when you're used to being, I call it sometimes like the default setting, right? Like the whole calendar that's put out by the United States is littered in my background's holidays. Like, I mean, it's more and more and more now that you'll see at least mention of, but like breaks in the calendar and even the structure of the calendar is very much from my default Christian background setting. And so, I mean, unless you're in environments where you actually have to think of it from another perspective, I think all of us have that tendency. You default to what you know. And if it's not something you're doing, then you're defaulting to whatever is being put out as the quote unquote norm, right? So even if you have a lot of people who don't go to church and do not identify as Christian, all the breaks and everything are still around that. It's not like you're not inundated with a Christian calendar, even if you don't identify that way. And so that's got to be fascinating when you're making plans in more of an interfaith setting. Then there are times where you have to think about, how do you schedule your meetings? What do you do when tragedy happens? How do you have a vigil? How do you walk alongside one another with that? So what are some ways that you do that as a chaplain in a more of an interfaith campus than, say, I don't live in an interfaith campus. I mean, unless you call the campus the whole community, and then it is. But
So what are you asking about, like, in particular?
like how do you gauge like when to support? Like, do you always support one another, I guess, with each other's? I'm thinking, I guess, particularly in our time right now with everything that's happening, when there's wars and crises and things like that. Like, how do you respond with an interfaith? Is sometimes the response as a chaplain to just be quiet and let others take the lead and just be present and supporting and keep your mouth shut? I mean, I find that difficult, because if I'm the default setting, then I always want to have space to talk, but sometimes the thing is shutting up and listening, right?
Mm.
So like, how do you manage? Because I just feel like you probably have to manage that more. And then, like, as you were saying, then somebody in my position, where I'd have to reach out for that. You, as on a campus with kids who come in from all over the world, with all that different variety of religious people in your building, you have to maneuver and understand that more. Do you feel like it makes you just a more aware chaplain? And if so, then how?
Yeah, so I think it does. I'm trying to be intentional about that. And yeah, shutting up and listening is usually the thing. Maybe not usually, but it's often the thing. So one great thing about this job is that Cornell never pays religious people to do religious work. It's always been a secular institution, and it has never officially given any kind of primacy to a particular religious identity. Although
Oh, okay.
functionally, if you know, Christians were the predominant religious identity for much of Cornell's history. Which means, so some places have a university chaplain with a capital U and a capital C, and then those people are sort of within the university system and have to function and speak as representatives of the university. And all the chaplains at Cornell, are hired by outside organizations, paid by outside organizations, and then sent onto the campus. And then we have credentials. We jump through some very appropriate hoops with the university to be able to use the spaces and have an office here and all that kind of stuff. So that there's a freedom in that to follow your conscience, to respond to whatever's going on in the way that seems best to you, and in accordance with whatever you discern the mind of Christ to be, you as an individual or you as an organization. So there's nobody ever presses me for an official statement on whatever just happened last week, whatever the thing is. So that's good. I like that. I like not having that pressure. I'd rather have somebody else releasing the official statement that's going to make everybody, that's
Right.
going to get them in trouble. Sometimes you just can't say anything officially without displeasing 75% of the people out there. And that's certainly been true of the president of this university in the last couple of months, since October 7th,
Yeah.
the events in Israel, and then the war that's been happening in Israel and Gaza. So to take that as an example, following on that, that was terrible for every Jewish person everywhere. It was at the beginning,
Yep.
and then at Cornell it got, and then very soon after that, it was terrible for every Palestinian person everywhere, and in some ways, by extension, many Muslim people who felt somehow implicated or whatever by what was going on, whether they actually were or not. There was a real worry that they would be perceived as participating somehow in that. And so, but then there were some truly horrific things that happened on our campus. There are these really awful, I mean, just as bad as can be, threats made online in an anonymous forum by someone who, well, we needn't get into all the details, but they were horrible threats, and they were credible at the time. And so, like, uh, police presence and FBI presence. Jewish spaces on campus were shut down largely. Jewish students were in our building here at the Hillel, in that sort of Hillel hallway end of the hall. They were just sitting in the halls doing their homework there because they didn't feel safe anywhere. They didn't know where else to go, and they didn't feel safe walking around, going to the library, going to camp,
Right.
just being out and about. And it was just so painful, so scary. Everybody, I'm sure, saw versions of it on the news. And it was really clear to me that my job during that time was to support my Jewish religious professional colleagues, to do whatever I could to support the Jewish chaplains, rabbis, and other professionals on campus, and to encourage the students that are part of my ministry to do the same for the Jewish students or family members or friends or whatever in their circles, to reach out with words of support, and then to listen, to learn, and then when those threats were made, they were anonymous, but they seemed to have come from someone who identified as Muslim. It turns out he wasn't, but the username that he used and whatever made it seem that way. And so a lot of Muslim students also felt unsafe and worried, and again implicated, especially at first. And so likewise, we did what we could to reach out in support to the Muslim population on campus. So that was a time when it was clear to me that the first thing to do was to show up where I could, to be a presence, a visible Christian presence, put on a collar, which I don't usually do, and all that kind of stuff. But then tend to the personal relationships we had. And that was the first thing. And then the second thing is I invited our students to really dive into what I think is inherently interfaith nature of Christianity. Many of us have gotten away with pretending that interfaith relations or interfaith thinking is a pleasant diversion for those Christians who are into that kind of thing. But it's not. We've always been interfaith.
Yes.
I mean, even just reading the Bible, any part of the Bible, it means it's gone. The words that you're reading have gone through 2 or 3 or 4 different languages, cultures, eras. So that and faiths, right? So that's interfaith. I mean, Jesus, as we all know, was Jewish, stayed Jewish, didn't become un-Jewish, wanted everybody to be more Jewish. And so like we're Christians worshiping a Jewish guy. So that's interfaith inherently, and not to mention that Jesus himself was a Palestinian Jew, right? So and on and on, you could, I could and have preached more than one sermon about this. So to really dig into a realization that interfaith work, dialogue, and listening is actually at the center of who we are as Christians, and not, as I said, a pleasant diversion for if you feel like it.
Now, this is, and that's brilliant. Everything you just said was brilliant, and I think it is good. And sometimes a sermon, I think, is best preached to sort of dig into those weeds a bit in times that you can't. Like, if you're not going to have a Bible study about it, if you're not going to have an extra class about it, you have to talk about it in the pulpit, because otherwise we keep perpetuating the same stories that we believe to be the truth without necessarily even looking at the text to go, what did that mean? And contextually, what did that mean? What did that mean at that time? What does it mean now? Well, how is the translation interpreted to be at this time? And what does that mean to us? And I think that's great. And speaking of that, I mean, and then you talk about your books, your writings, right? Advent and Christmas. There's been a lot of harm in some of the way these stories have been perpetuated, in multiple ways. We could probably talk an hour just on the multiple ways that this story has been used to hurt or oppress or to cause harm. Like, I recently was asked about, would I be okay doing a baptism of like a couple who wasn't married? And I was like, well, Joseph and Mary weren't married. So no. but
So
like,
wait, was there an actual family asking for that, or was this just a theoretical thing that
no,
somebody
it was
was
an
testing
actual
you with?
family
Okay.
asking, like, are you comfortable? Like, okay, we would like you to do the baptism, but we want to be transparent, right? This is the baptism of a baby, right? Where the partners are together, but they're not married. They may never get married, but they're
Yeah.
raising their child together. And I was like, yeah, sounds great.
Well, we're so glad they came to
Like,
you. I'm so glad you're their pastor.
well, and not right, because you would get a different answer, not from me,
Maybe,
but
yeah.
from other people.
Yeah.
Um, and so that's what I mean, like when we embed it into the story. So how do you balance that as you write on, because historically, like a lot of, right, this gets into a deeper history. We don't have to deep dive into how these ancient First Testament texts have been used to sort of replace or to, how they tell the story. So how do you balance that when you're doing the writings for such a specific season of the church of Advent and Christmas, which are actually, I think, 2 seasons of the church, right? But Christmas is very short. Hallmark has made it seem like Christmas is the 12 days before. It's a countdown to
Yeah.
Christmas, but we know it's not.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Um,
We've lost that battle, by the way. I
we,
think that all of us who
I,
are like, no Christmas carols during Advent, all that stuff. Fair enough, but also we've lost.
yeah,
FYI,
we've
all the
lost.
Christians out there, sorry.
Yeah, if that's the war on Christmas, we lost. Like,
Yeah,
right.
we can still have Christmas,
And also
just a
in
little
my nativity
earlier.
scenes, Jesus is out already. He's not supposed to be, but
Yeah.
whatever.
Oh yeah.
He's fully
Totally.
there in the picture. But so how do you balance that as you're writing? Because I imagine you don't just like sit down and go, what do I feel like talking? When you're writing a book, it's not the same as like writing just like your journal. Like it's a
Yeah.
very different process. So what's the process of doing that as a clergy? And you're a very educated, well-read, well-rounded person. So how do you balance how do you balance that?
Well, one thing is the best advice I have for writing a book is do it as a set of daily devotions, and then nothing you write has to connect to the next thing you write, or the next. You know what I mean? If you write a sort of real book, the whole all has to connect.
Yes,
But
because
if
we've
you're
all
just
read those
writing
books that don't.
300 words for today and 300 words for tomorrow and 300 like you don't need transitions. It doesn't have to make sense next to each other. So like that's the way to go if you can get away with it.
Awesome.
And that's what I did. I mean, I think that if you knew nothing about Christianity except the Christmas story, if you didn't know how Jesus's life ends and then starts again and continue, like I will first say that I don't think you can understand Christmas without Easter, and I don't think you can understand Easter without Christmas. But if you tried, if someone just was like, gave you the first chunk of each of the Gospels and said, "Here's
Right.
everything,"
Here's this alien who came here, and we're telling the alien the Christmas
yeah,
story. They are hearing only
right.
the Christmas story.
And let's say you also have enough about the First Testament, about the Jewish scriptures too, to kind of understand some of the Isaiah references and whatever the references to prophecy. I think I can't understand how anyone could read that story and not be and take in that story and not be further opened to the to anyone who's vulnerable in the world. I mean, so it starts with a teenage girl, a very well-educated teenage girl. Let's remember, as soon as she finds out that that this maybe is going to happen with Jesus, even sort of as in the same moment where she gives her consent, and I think that's one really important thing is that she gives her consent. Gabriel,
Right.
and by extension, God waits for her to say, "Let it be with me according to your word." And I don't believe God would have moved without consent. So that's one thing right there. Like
Right.
if you took nothing else from the Christmas story except bodily autonomy and consent for everyone, but particularly for women, then like we could all take a giant step forward as a society if we all
Yeah.
started living according the way God lived in that moment. But then Mary busts out this song, the Magnificat, which is from her own religious tradition that she's kind of riffing on a song that Hannah sang generations before. So that means she knows her stuff. She's, she may not have been literate,
Right.
but she certainly was well educated. So, and then she's engaged to a man named Joseph. You know the story, and he believes her. She comes to him and says this unbelievable thing about her own body and her
Right.
own experience. And he, at least in the story, the sort of apocryphal parts of the story, is a really old guy. Doesn't actually say that in the Bible, but the way we understand him is often that he's pretty old. This old man believes a young woman when she says what happened to her and her body. He believes her. He doesn't say she misunderstood. He doesn't claim that he knows better. He doesn't claim, he doesn't mansplain any of it to her. He just believes her. And if we took nothing else but that from the story, we would all take a giant leap forward as a society. And then there's the Magi who come from far away. So there's this like interfaith piece there, right? Like the non-Christians, there weren't Christians yet, but like people from sort of outside the story are essential in like moving the story forward and identifying Jesus as special. And then they become refugees. There's the madness of a ruler starts murdering children, and they become refugees and have to live in a far place for however long it is,
say
years.
that is a part of the story that many people always want to jump over, is Herod like slaughtering all kids, all boys under the age 2 and under. Just boom. Like I was like, what? It's so horrific. It's unimaginable.
Yep. Yeah. And so the creator of heaven and earth needing to become a refugee to escape war and madness and depend on the kindness of whoever is living in the land where they finally show up. We don't really have the story of what happened in Egypt and whatever. And so we don't know those details, but they survived. So somebody must have been kind to them, or at least not actively cruel to them.
I like that, kind and or actively cruel.
Not actively cruel. Kind,
not actively cruel.
Yeah.
Right. No, but
and before we even get to that, let's remember, what you were saying, a pregnant, unwed teenager, an unmarried couple, wandering, being forced by bonkers laws. You have to go to the place you're from to be registered or whatever. And by the way, I'm putting aside all questions of historicity and all of this. Let's take the story at its face value. But so somebody passes a bonkers law or decree, and that like torpedoes the lives of this couple who have to go in the most vulnerable possible way to far places and be houseless for at least some of the story. And and we could go on, and I have other times, but like to see that story, that all of this happening in the life of the creator of heaven and earth, who took on a body for our sake, and in the life of his parents, and not be made more kind, more open, more willing to help people when they need it, who more willing to believe people when they tell you what their experience of the world is, more willing to welcome and learn from people from wildly different places and cultures. I don't know how people manage to not be made more loving and open if they believe any part of this story.
And yet, right? And yet, I mean, we do. And I think some of it is that many of us have grown up in places where we didn't have a pastor or a teacher telling us the story through the same lens that you're telling the story today to those of us who are hearing it, who, at least to go, hey, maybe it didn't exactly happen this way, but let's think about the other things it could possibly mean for us today as people who are hearing this story. Is it a call to be more like Herod? Is it a call to like be, be open to and expect that we'll ask for, consent will be given, ask for and received, all that kind of stuff. I think there are often times where we're not. It's just this pretty little story, and then we put it to music, and when we do that, I think we eliminate some of the power of that story. and the impact it becomes. I mean, I love Hallmark movies, but that's what it becomes. It becomes this beautiful Hallmark movie all wrapped up with this happy little ending, and it's like, well, that story did not get wrapped up with a happy little ending.
Yeah.
Like, it.
And it's also, it can alienate people who are having a bad Christmas for whatever
Correct.
reason, because of whatever bad thing is going on in their lives, or that they lived through in the last year, or the person who's not there this Christmas for the first time ever, or first time in decades, the spouse that died, or whatever tragedy may have
Right.
befallen, and so a lot of churches have a blue Christmas service to make a space for that, and that's great. I do worry a little bit that it sort of quarantines the sad people from the general population or whatever. I do, but if they want that
Yeah.
space, then I'm glad they have that space. But I do think that the proper context for Christmas is sadness and despair. That's what, like, if stuff wasn't pretty messed up, why would God need to have bothered?
Yeah.
We wouldn't need all of this to have happened if the world wasn't broken and full of misery and despair, and not in desperate need of a little spark of hope that maybe will catch and become something bigger. And I talked a minute ago about how vulnerable Mary and Joseph and Jesus were at different times, but let's also point out that Mary is a total badass, and Joseph is a hero. They're both, while they're suffering from vulnerability and lack of resources and all this stuff, they're also, Mary's brilliant, right? She's this like super educated person, and she's a teenager who then sings the Magnificat. She's
Right.
like bringing down the powerful from their thrones, and sending the rich empty away, and all of
Right.
this, and then just like producing a child from your own body under any circumstances is heroic. But then to do what she did in the way that she had
Right.
to do it. So like to I think that's another important theme, is that you can both be vulnerable and ill-treated by the world, and a total badass.
Right.
And in fact, that's probably the normal state for most people who are vulnerable and ill-treated by the world, because that's how you survive, is by like being stronger than the
Right.
rich people need to be, with all of our comforts and ease around us. Um, so I want to like never let go of the dual nature of what's going on in this family, the like terribleness of the world, and then the hope that they show forth by being strong badasses.
Yeah. Well, it's coming back, and so you forgive me because I really do have to suck on cough drops to get through right now. Like, I lost my voice. I just woke up on a Sunday morning with no voice, and I thought, why can't I be reading Zachariah? Like, why can't I be reading that story today about about him finding out he was going to have a baby, he and Elizabeth, and going, and God just being like, no, you
Oh,
don't
and he's
accept
mute.
it. Mute, you're
Right? Yeah,
muted.
yeah.
Like, I was like, that would have been brilliant if that had been the text, but it wasn't. It wasn't the text, but it was in my head all the time. Like, as you're talking about the way that Joseph and Mary, and I would say Elizabeth, embraced the news, and the way that he was like, of course, the religious person was like, no, that miracle cannot happen. I
Yeah,
mean, it's really quite fascinating. And then to get unmuted, right, upon the birth of his
yeah.
child. But I think there's a lot there that can be talked about also about the different ways that people become parents and have children, and the different stories that are related for there. Because sometimes we have this like normal story that we tell, even though as Christians the story was quite abnormal. It's quite
Yeah.
an anomaly. And yet we're like, no, this is the prescribed way that people become a parent. And I think there would be, again, I think that's a powerful thing in this story, is to say, no, people become parents in all sorts of ways. Like, my husband and I became parents in, I guess, more traditional ways, but at the same time, without modern medicine, I
Mhm.
wouldn't be here right now. I would have died in my first childbirth, definitely almost in my second. And I almost did. Like, they were both emergency C-sections. And yet there's no less importance to the birth story of my family and I. And then, other people in my family have different stories. Other friends have different stories. You're somebody whose story is very different. And I think that this story could be used to widen, right? Not instead of narrow the way, but to widen the way of acceptance and inclusivity about the different ways and the different times in our lives. Like Elizabeth was old. They were old. That's why it was
Yeah.
unbelievable, right? And so I do have your first book, but not your second. Do you touch on that in any of the devotions about that at all, or even maybe personally?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, so Jesus is adopted, right? And that's really important. My two sons are adopted, and so Jesus being adopted is by Joseph, right? Is an important theme in the story that we're always careful to pull out when we're talking about it as a family. Not to mention Moses being adopted, long before.
Right, right.
So that piece, and then I do think of God as a person, but I think of God as a person who's many gendered and beyond gender. And I work really hard to not use masculine pronouns for God or male identities, or at least to really balance a variety of identities. But at Christmas alone, I'm happy to say that Jesus had two dads. If God is a dude, at least sometimes, and then Joseph, uh, a different kind of two dads than my kids have. But
Yeah.
I every once in a while will pull that out just
Well,
just because.
but the thing is I think, again, that's great. Then it gives you the ability to embrace that. I mean, there there definitely were times, like biblically, right? Like my marriage and your marriage would not exist if
Yeah,
cultures hadn't changed, right?
right.
Um and then you just get to see like that I've always loved the United Church of Christ. God is still speaking, and that's part
Mhm.
of it, right? Is that is the part of the continual conversation of God, is not that God has changed, but that God's people continue to change so that we can hear what God is saying to us. Because I don't think God ever said much about some of the things that how we interpret it, right? Like
Right.
right, there's a lot of they them in the pronouns early, right, in the
Yeah,
original
right.
translations, that then get very genderized as it's been
Yeah.
translated over and over and over again. And so there was a time where, like, you and your husband, me and my husband, we would not have been able to have the families that we have if we'd been born in different eras,
Yeah.
or even born in this era, right?
Yeah.
You had that
And
experience even in this era. For me, it was 1960s and 70s, though there's still people who think it's atrocious.
yeah.
They're not in my circle. But then for you and your husband, that's modern times. That's like
Yeah. In my adulthood,
in
modern times. Yeah. Since you and I were in seminary. Yeah.
yeah.
Uh and in every what that makes me think of, though, is that the relationships that now have been sanctioned or allowed legally have always existed, often in secret, in hiding, in defiance of the state, um, because love wins. But that also makes me think of another piece of the Christmas story that I love, which is when the Magi come and they go to Herod and say, we saw the child star at its rising. Where is he? And Herod freaks out, and then starts the massacre of the innocents that we were talking about earlier. But Herod gives the Magi really explicit instructions, like tries to turn them into spies. Go find the kid, come back and report, so that, and then Herod doesn't say this to them, but so that I can kill him. And the Magi figure this out, and so they go home by a different way, right? They don't go back past Herod's house on their way home, and I think that's a really important moment, because it's foreigners, people, but in this case, foreigners, very different from the locals, defying the will of the state to protect the innocent. And I think that's one of the calls that Christians have, that some well-behaved people don't want to pay attention to, don't want to live by. But like when the laws of the state come into conflict with the laws of conscience and the laws and guidance that God has given us around protecting the innocent, then we have to choose, and
Mhm.
it's better to choose God than the state.
I
Which is
I
what I
mean,
would say that people
yes.
in marriages and relationships like ours were doing long ago, and right up until it became legal. Maybe not for religious reasons, but um, leading with love, living into love, no matter what the state said they were supposed to be
Right.
doing.
And several of our transgendered brothers and sisters and people, and non-bi people, all gendered, right? It continues to be a problem,
Yep.
um, for like whether or not they can get married in the church. It depends on their denomination, or how the state forces them to genderize themselves on forms, even if
Hmm.
you know, and I can't imagine that level of pain. I've never been denied any of my labels or
Yeah.
told that my labels aren't my labels. I've never been, that's never existed for me. Um, the closest I become, and it's certainly not like life is like, people sometimes are like, oh, you're really nice. And I'm like, I'm really not. I'm kind, but I'm not really nice. That's a label I reject. But that's not anything from the state. That's just my own
Yeah.
understanding of those terms, or the way that they feel validated for me, that I'm like, I thank you, but no, no, thank you. And so I think that also, again, it makes me go, when people speak, as you've described the story of Jesus's birth, when people speak, sometimes the role is to sit and listen.
Yes. Yes. That's just where my mind was going, to go
Yeah.
back to what you said before. Like, I have a similar experience. Very few of my, like, I mostly inhabit powerful identities, right? On wherever there's a more powerful and a less powerful binary or
Right.
spectrum, I'm almost, by almost every measure, I'm on the more powerful one. So shut up, Quinn. Just when you're talking to someone who inhabits historically oppressed or historically underrepresented or less powerful, or currently oppressed or underrepresented identity, um, just shut up and listen, Quinn. And like, I
Call on your inner Joseph and just accept it without
yeah,
question.
yeah,
Right.
and don't play devil's advocate. Like, the the devil has enough advocates. Like, nobody needs you to be like, help. Just listen and learn. And um, why not? What's there is no downside to Quinn not pronouncing on every issue. Uh, and
Right.
there's just no downside to that. So be quiet and listen.
And I do think sometimes I've said, reason why in some social media and even personal interactions I've stepped back from stating my opinion is, I was like, sometimes I feel forced to have an opinion on
Yeah.
topics and subjects I don't have an opinion on. I'm
Hmm.
like, I don't, no, I don't, I don't care. It's like Sunday Night Football. I don't care who's playing. Who are you rooting? If I'm at somebody's house, I'm like, I'll root for whoever you're rooting for.
Yeah.
But or not, because I'm just there for the snacks. Like, I'm not, it's not really anything else for me. And sometimes I feel like right now, in this place where we're living in a more, things are both and it's not this or that. Like, we're transitioning to that notion or concept of like inviting more in. There's this other tug of saying, no, you must be forced to choose. And you must state your opinion on everything. And I'm like, I mean, even if I have an opinion on it, it doesn't mean everybody else has to share that opinion. Like, I think dark chocolate's better, but it's okay if you like white chocolate. I don't consider that chocolate, but whatever, you do you. Like, it's your favorite, go ahead.
You're allowed to be wrong. You can be wrong too.
Exactly. I am allowed to be wrong, and they're allowed to be wrong too. But like my liking dark chocolate doesn't mean the world has to take that
Yeah.
on, and it doesn't have to be. And sometimes we talk about these things like there are real life and death things, and then there are so many other things that aren't. Like, forced identification and who you can marry, those are real life traumas, right?
Yeah.
Like, suicide rates for people who identify as trans and or non-binary, that's real statistical facts. um kids are still getting kicked out of their homes for coming out. That's why it is still a big deal. And,
Yeah.
I don't care how many characters on a TV show identify as gay, it still has made it not, I mean, it's still a big deal.
Yeah. And the so we've been talking about shutting up and listening
Yeah.
and not having to have an opinion on every single issue, or not stating an opinion on every single issue, and that's real. And at the same time, I try to be aware of the all those powerful identities I inhabit that I
Mhm.
just was talking about. Means that I have um, an obligation to speak, a moral obligation to speak and take positions sometimes, and then as a clergy person, with whatever authority goes along with that in society or in my particular context, to speak and take positions, and sometimes public positions, for the sake of the good of the world, on behalf of the suffering. And I have a microphone and an ordination and all this stuff,
Right.
platforms of various kinds that other people don't have. And so I try to work really hard to use those in faithful ways, for those that need that support. But the shut up and listen part is wherever I can. I try to use those platforms and my microphone, my metaphorical and literal microphone, to boost the signal of whoever it is that we're talking about. So you were talking about trans
Yeah.
issues. So like the world doesn't probably need to hear Quinn offering his own thoughts about trans issues, but the world does need to hear trans and non-binary people speaking about their own experience and speaking up for
Yes.
themselves. And I can help the world hear those voices.
Yeah.
Or there are, yeah, I can help. And so I try to do that
Yeah.
wherever I
And one of
can.
the smallest ways I can help is by calling you by the name you want to be called and the
Yeah.
pronouns that you wish to use. That feels like very minor comparatively
Yep.
to the battle that's being raged. But what you're also speaking of, which I think the Advent story tells as well, is you're talking about intentionality, like making choices. That's setting our intentions on what we're doing. Like Mary was intentional about the way that she accepted that invitation. Joseph was intentional about the way that he opened up to hear the story. Like the Magi were intentional about going back another way. It wasn't just coincidence, right? They didn't just do it on a fluke. They did it with discernment of what knowledge they had to discern. And sometimes I feel like, I mean, I struggle with this. I struggle sometimes to sit long enough in the waiting to actually discern versus what, that gut instinct is telling me to do. And some of that comes, I think, just with age, like just aging, you get a little bit better. Or at least I feel like I've gotten
We hope. Yeah, we're trying.
try. Like we met before we were 25 and before our brains were fully formed. And there are things that I'm like, Leah at 40, almost 46 would not do what Leah at 23 did.
Yeah, same.
Like,
And I'm
thank
not the
God
first
we can make
40-something-year-old to
mistakes.
say this, but how happy are we that social media did not exist when we were in our early 20s, and
Praise
everyone wasn't
God
carrying
is a
phones,
great
cameras
God.
in their pockets all day long, and maybe more to the point, all evening long while
Right.
they're out.
God is wonderful. And I
Yeah.
am so grateful for that blessing. Thank you, Jesus. Right. All the time. Yeah, it's a different world. Like our kids are growing up in a very different environment than we have. You have students that you pastor that are growing up in a very different world. And it doesn't, when everything is recorded or everything lasts forever, things begin, then the intention has to be more important. But you're telling people to learn how to be intentional at a time where they haven't even fully developed yet. And so it's hard not to micromanage. I find it hard not to micromanage as a parent. And some of that is just going, yeah, you don't get any of those apps. Like, no, here's your phone. No, you don't get any of those things. You can't have a presence there. Because I either find them toxic or I know my own child, to go, that's not a space where you'll do well. and I do feel like that's a role as a parent that I have to guide them through and help
Mhm.
them to function with that. But I also find it's very hard not to helicopter in a way that I actually don't want to helicopter.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. And I also I have the same experience, and I feel underqualified for that piece of the job. I mean, I feel underqualified for most of being a parent, but especially there because I didn't uh, go through my formative years with social media around, and so I only know what an old thinks about social media, not uh, what
I
today's
mean, we had
youths think about it.
MySpace, right? Yeah.
I didn't though. I didn't even
You,
know about MySpace till it was like over.
ah,
And you say social media to me, and I still Facebook is still what comes to my mind. And my students are like, "Face what?" They're not there at all. Uh, and it's just like it's a. I don't have anything new to say about this that smarter people than I haven't already said, but
also me, yeah.
it's just so different from what I lived through,
Yeah,
and
and I hope it allows for error, and yet some of the harm can be reduced. Does that make sense? Like I still want people to be able to make mistakes and be forgiven, and that we
yeah,
still know how to do that without writing somebody off and out and like whatever. And sometimes people deserve to be
yeah,
out, whatever. There's a power in that as well. And but I think like my Christianity with redemption and reconciliation doesn't allow for certain, like there's a huge aspect in our theology about reconciliation and redemption and forgiveness, and that punitive stuff really is in God's hands. It's really not mine. Like God's going to do that judgment and
mm,
punishing that I really want to do. I think I really have, you
yeah,
know what I mean? And so it gets hard. And then I still want people to make mistakes, but at the same time, when harm is being inflicted, like when you have these stories where you see real harm on social media of somebody being hurt or victimized, or just some of the atrocious things that kids will do and snap and then share, um I want the line to be distinct, right? I want that line in the stand to be like, no, no, you can't do that. That kind of harm is not tolerated here. And so I kind of hope that social media can be used in a way to help people understand the power of their own personal power to inflict harm on other people.
hmm yeah, yeah. And what I think that we have not figured out as individuals, but certainly as a society, like what um so because internet, sometimes the mistakes that we make are forever, right? They can't be erased. They can't be you can't they just are there in cyberspace forever. And like what does that mean? What if I make a mistake, what do I deserve? Do I deserve to have it, fade away into memory and kind of disappear? Or is the mistake, so what I call a mistake is actually life changing and
Right.
damaging for someone else? I'm like, oops, sorry, but their life is forever changed by something I did or said or whatever. And what do they want? Do they want a
Right.
forever record of that mistake, or do they not? Who's that good for? Who's it not good for? Like all of that is very much up in the air, I think. And I mean, it's here whether we like it or not. But like what it means for accountability, and for restoration to the community after harm has been done is, I don't think we're anywhere near sorting all that out yet.
No, and I do hope, as clergy, this is a dialogue I would really like to have. Like, and I would say an interfaith dialogue I would really like to have with
Yeah.
environments to talk about, what does this stuff mean? What does AI mean? What does it mean for gene splicing? What does it mean for records that never end? Well, you talked about science at the beginning. We're going to bookend it here before I transition to my last question, but um and again, I'm not somebody who's knowledgeable enough to be leading those conversations. But I would really like to have those conversations on like the differences between IVF and surrogacy and like gene splicing and creating and like eliminating certain things. Those are not the same. They are the similar. I mean, there's a bunch of science involved in that, but the ethics of those things are very different.
Yeah.
At least in my opinion, but I want to have dialogues about that sort of stuff to say what are the ethics involved here of like permanent records, permanent changes, whether, in whatever environment that they may be. So when you organize that at Cornell, you just tell me and I'll come in
Okay.
or listen. I'll come and listen. Yeah, but I do you get to have conversations like that more in your setting than like somebody like me who's talking to?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, there conversations like that are going on around me all the time more
Right.
than when I was a local church pastor, or maybe I'm just aware of them more than I was then. And so there's plenty of opportunities to sit in and listen and attend and become smarter on a variety of topics around here. So I don't know if I have them more, but I certainly like have access to other people having them more. And so try to take advantage of that when I can.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's awesome. So we're up to my final question, which is
Okay.
always the same. Which my final question, and this would be because we're in the same age range, you would be familiar with the Care Bears. So my question, as this is something that hasn't changed from even before my 20s, is my random questions of the day, or what I like to ask a lot of questions. And that has not changed over time and space. That has continued to be a core part of my personality. But so my question, I think that the Care Bears are an embodiment of a modern, like if I had to draw the Holy Spirit in today's day and age, it would be a Care Bear. That's for me, that's how I think of it. So,
Okay.
and I do think we are all born with core gifts and personalities and things that,
Okay.
these love things that we get to shoot out into the world. So my question, Quinn, is if you were a Care Bear, if Quinn is a Care Bear, and you don't have to be one of the Care Bears, like the actual Care Bears, you can create your own. So what color Care Bear or colors would you be? You don't have to limit. And then what is the emblem, the core emblem on your belly that you are putting out in forms of pure love to heal and make the world whole, much like the Care Bear stare? So what's your Care Bear stare belly emblem?
I just would, if my eyes looked like they went unfocused for a minute, I just was clicking over desperately to
Be
another
like,
window.
who's a
I thought
Care
you were
Bear?
going to ask me which real Care Bear there. I was, and I was like, I can't come up with any. But now
You're like the one with
now I
the
hear what you're asking.
the one with the heart, right?
Oh, well, I was thinking that there's a lion one. Isn't there a lion
There's a
Care Bear?
lion.
That's where I was just going to say that for funsies. But okay, to answer the question you actually asked, I think it would be I would be following on Hildegard of Bingen, who is a mystic and a brilliant composer and a million other things, a brilliant preacher. She like went on Taylor Swift style preaching tours of Europe in the Middle Ages, back when women had hardly any public were allowed to have hardly any public voice, and like popes and princes would listen to her preach and her theology. And a core piece of her theology is a word she invented, viriditas, which she made it up. So it's kind of, you can translate, obviously it's Latin, and you can translate it a bunch of different ways, but people most often translate it as greening. And she understood that to be one of the great powers of God, is the greening, or the sort of explosive life force that God pours into the world. And the opposite of viriditas is ariditas. So that's dry. You can hear arid in that word. So dryness, desert, all that kind of stuff. So against that barren lifelessness, God has viriditas, which is like life exploding into the world. And so So I guess I would be a green Care Bear. I really want to say orange because that's my favorite color, but I'll say green. And then I don't know
I
what the
went with my
symbol
favorite.
is.
Yeah.
The what's the symbol of Veriditas? I don't know. I
You
guess
can make
like
it up. I mean, the word is,
yeah,
you can make up your symbol. You have all empowered to do that.
yeah. I mean, it would be something like leafy and like moving though, not just leaves sitting there. It would have some energy and life, like it was like taking over in the best way.
I think of what is it, Fern Gully? That movie. Oh gosh, it was
Oh,
long ago where they just stepped on leaves and then they just
oh, I don't remember that. I'll go look that up.
they just
I mean,
like
I remember the movie, but I don't remember the image you're talking
unfolded.
about.
I think that was that one. That might have been a different kid movie. That might have been Beyonce as the voice of, what is it, Epic, modern day. I think that happened there. But
Mm.
she voices like the Mother Earth or whatever in that movie. I have tons of ridiculous, my brain like soaks movie stuff up like a
Pop culture references for days
for
inside Leah's head.
days. For days. I mean, and it's hard. It's really hard. Is like these are moments that I realize I've gotten old, is because there are several now that I don't get.
Yeah.
Like that I don't understand. Though I will say, and we'll end on this, but it was a private joy. But recently I was watching A Few Good Men with my eldest, and it gets to the scene with Jack Nicholson saying, you can't handle the
Can't
truth.
handle the truth, right?
And they go, oh, that's where that meme comes from. I was like, oh my gosh, there's so many kid, but I just love that they they got it. And it was like this new, like, oh, people have posted this before. I know what this is now. I know the context of this reference. And I don't know, it made me feel like our worlds met for just a brief minute.
We just had that experience. We watched the best Christmas movie of all time, Die Hard, with our older son, and there's the famous line that starts with the word yippee-ki-yay.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah.
And he, which I'm just realizing now is probably racist to even say, because anyway,
Yeah, maybe.
but he had that same experience. That's where that phrase comes from. And I was like, have you ever said have you said that phrase? Because I bet, but whatever.
Yeah, my son does 3D printing, and I saw this like Nakatomi Plaza Tower countdown to Christmas.
Oh yeah, it's not Christmas until Hans Gruber falls from Nakatomi Tower.
And we do watch that
Nakatomi
now.
Plaza, yeah.
Yeah, we do watch it as a family. It has forever been my Christmas movie, though. Because it was my mom first. She first called it. She was like, that's my favorite Christmas movie. We watched it every year since it like came out as a Christmas movie. And then it became this big thing. And like, while my husband loves this movie, he's still like, it's not a Christmas movie. But he was like,
Yeah.
I do love the movie, but he can't go. He's like, it doesn't embody the spirit of Christmas. And I was like, I feel like that's wrong. It's about reconciliation, all the death and despair. Oh, no, he reconciles his marriage, and somebody gets made whole in their relationship together. I feel like there's a lot there, though I probably will never preach a sermon on it. Somebody somewhere can. But it is part of.
So I said it was the best Christmas movie ever. I don't consider it the best Christmas movie ever, but I do consider it a Christmas movie. I mostly said that just to to be incendiary. My position is that if Die Hard is not a Christmas movie, then Home Alone is not a Christmas movie.
Oh, that
But
feels.
if one is, then the other is, because they both have Christmas as sort of the context, but then like the conflict and the story is about non-Christmas things, and it's just decorations in the background. So if Home Alone is, Die Hard is.
Die Hard is.
I can't. The same should be true of Gremlins, but I can't quite get my head around Gremlins as a Christmas movie.
It is a Christmas movie, right? In terms of the fact that he was bought for Christmas presents.
Oh, I guess that's true. Yeah, and Phoebe Cates' poor father died in the chimney dressed like Santa.
Oh, poor Gizmo. That whole story. But anyway, we could go on. I could go on with that forever with Christmas themed movies, and people can comment as this podcast airs about whether or not they think Die Hard is a Christmas movie or Home Alone or any of the others. Though they are the ones we routinely watch in our home around this season. It is Christmas for me. But anyway, it has been a pleasure to chat with you.
You
Thank you.
too. It's so good to see you.